Okay, good evening. First, let me thank both Al and Rick Drew for inviting me here. I've been a 23-year resident of Canyon Country, and it's always nice to come and speak to some place where I'm only 5 minutes from home, because I do travel around quite a bit. So, interesting enough, they gave the title of the presentation tonight, Preventing Hate and Prejudice. Unfortunately, while there are steps that we can do, and I will talk about some of those, it's not an easy subject to prevent, unfortunately. I've been a researcher in the field of hate and extremism for 32 years. It would seem that however long I want to work, I've got plenty to do, and it's not going away. So I'm just going to talk about part of what I do. When I first started doing this work, we didn't have the internet. I basically had to subscribe to various publications of extremist groups and so forth, and write them letters, get their printed publications, occasionally get invited to and go to their meetings and things like that. So over the years, it's changed quite a bit, and it was not long after I started working at the Simon Wiesenthal Center that we got into digital. For those of you not familiar with the center, the center is the parent organization of the Museum of Tolerance in West LA. Some of your kids or grandchildren have probably been there, maybe some probably more than once. But Simon Wiesenthal was a Holocaust survivor. He was a landscape architect before World War II. He was captured. He worked for the resistance. He was then captured, spent time in a half a dozen different concentration camps before ending up in Mauthausen in Austria, where he was liberated. While most survivors wanted to go on with their lives, Simon Wiesenthal decided that he wanted to hopefully bring to justice the people that had perpetrated the crimes of the Holocaust. And he dedicated his life until he was in his mid-90s when he passed away. And over the years, he was responsible in some form or another for exposing some 1,100 plus war criminals, including, among others, the man who arrested Anne Frank. So our center is named for him, dedicated to him, and we're an activist organization. And as I said, my job has been extremism. So I want to talk a little bit about extremism. Obviously, over the last couple of months, we've been talking about the fact that what happened in Charlottesville and the like. And to understand what's going on in extremism today, have to look at the past. Charlottesville was very interesting, and I spent a lot of time just watching the news coverage and the like, and there were some interesting differences, because for about 40 years, from the 1960s all the way into 2002, 2004, the white supremacy movement, the extremist movement, was dominated by a half a dozen major people. You see 4 of them on the screen there. William Pierce, Richard Butler, Tom Metzger, who some of you may have heard of. He was our Southern California white supremacist in Fallbrook, California. And Matt Hale, a younger guy who took over an existing organization. But what's happened is that the top 2, and I'll talk about them a little bit, those 2 have passed on. Tom Metzger is now close to 80 and has moved on to Indiana and is not as active. And Matt Hale down there on the bottom right is spending 40 years in federal prison for trying to solicit the murder of a federal judge. So what happened is, after these guys left the scene, is there was the white supremacy extremist movement was pretty much rudderless for about 10, 12 years. We had a whole young generation come up. William Pierce, he was Dr. William Pierce. He was actually a professor of physics at Oregon State University in the 60s, gave up academia, started an organization called the National Alliance, or the National Youth Alliance. He was infamous for writing the book, The Turner Diaries, which essentially is a blueprint for a race war. It was the book that was used in a number of different cases, including the Oklahoma City bombing, which it talked about blowing up the FBI building at the same time of the day with the same type of bomb that was used in Oklahoma City. Timothy McVeigh, when he was arrested, had those passages of the book on his person at the time he was arrested. So Pierce was one of the most important figures. The other one was Richard Butler from Aryan Nations, a group you may have heard up in Idaho. They, for many years, were up in Idaho, and they'd have racist gatherings and so forth. Really gave Idaho a bad name because they were up on 20 acres in a very nice place called Hayden Lake and near Coeur d'Alene. And you know, everybody thought, well, Idaho's a Nazi state. Wasn't the case, but these guys did give it a bad name. This was the entrance to Aryan Nations. That guy in the picture looked a little younger at the time. So what happened, as I said, the white supremacy movement was pretty much rudderless for a long time. And what happened was a whole new generation of young people has come up. And that's the people that we now hear of called the alt-right. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So there had not been any really big major rallies for a long time. And they put together this rally in Charlottesville, which by now everyone has heard of. Interestingly enough, when they started advertising for this, they took, at the bottom, you see the classic Ben Franklin cartoon illustration from the Revolution, Join or Die, and it has the various states that at the time. So what the extremists for Charlottesville did is they took that illustration and added their own logos and groups in the same fashion. I'm going to skip that. That's a video. I need to skip over that. Can you move the cursor so I can skip over that? Yeah, I think that's it. So before the day rally, they had this torch march at night. And there were literally hundreds of these guys carrying torches and chanting. And they had a number of different chants. One, "You will not replace us." "Jews will not replace us." "One people, one nation, end immigration." "Hebes will not replace us," and then "Blood and soil." And what was interesting about this, and all these guys as we move through here, the new modem is, you know, it used to be and there were at Charlottesville, there were swastika flags, there were Confederate battle flags and so forth, but they were in the minority. What's happened, and that's the way the white supremacy movement used to be, what's happened is these guys are now calling themselves nationalists. But what's interesting is that the Nazi philosophy is still there, and you look at those slogans on the screen there, and especially the last one, "Blood and soil," is a racialist term from Germany going back to the late 1890s that was made very popular during the 1930s and through the World War II period. The slogan there, "One people, one nation, end immigration." Well, one people, one nation, one Führer was the Nazi slogan. So there are a lot of little things, little subtleties here, but they still smack of classic white supremacy and neo-Nazism. Some of the interesting things that I found were some of the other symbols that you found. And this is a guy from the National Socialist Movement, the largest neo-Nazi party in this country, from about 3-4 years ago at a rally. And you look at his shield there. It's got the National Socialist Movement and the swastika. He's also got the stars and stripes from the flag. But this is what he had at the time, one of them had at the time of Charlottesville. And you see that they've replaced the swastika and put that symbol there. Anybody familiar with that symbol that's on the shield there on the right? It's called the Odin rune. And it's the runic symbols are used by, they were pagan, pre-Christian, it's actually pre-Christian language. But the various runes mean different things, and especially to the white supremacy movement. So this is actually the Odin rune, or the symbol of strength for the Odin, the pagan god. But they've tried to kind of shield what they're actually promoting. Similar here, this is you see this guy with the Nagar Nag, which is Swedish for enough is enough. And yes, like I say, there were the Confederate battle flags and so forth, but in the hours of coverage that I watched, there were relatively few of those. This particular shield also, if you remember, kind of upset the people at the Detroit Lions, because it was pretty close to the symbol that they use. Another one that was interesting was this group, a group that was relatively new called Vanguard America. Again, a lot of young people. You see, they're all dressed in the same way with the khakis and the three-button shirts and so forth. And James Alex Fields there up on the top left is actually the guy who drove the car which killed Heather Heyer. And again, they're trying to promote themselves as something other than they really are, although when you get real close, this was an advertisement for their website, they have no qualm about being anti-Semitic, because in their eyes, Jews are the ones who control everything, who have brought us immigration and just about everything else. This is another one, the Traditionalist Workers' Party, another relatively young group over the last few years. You see the symbol there with the pitchfork and the cog, which is supposed to represent the cog for the working industrial people and the pitchfork for the farmers. What's interesting, again, is you see the symbolism here. They've taken that with this eagle and put their symbol in the eagle's talons. Well, this is the same eagle that the Nazis used, except they had a swastika in the talons. So a lot of these subtle symbols that they're now using. This is one more example, is the sun wheel there. You see on the guy's shield in the red and white there. This is a sun wheel which is used. It's actually, it was used by some Nazis. It's actually a more ancient symbol, but in Europe, where some people can't display swastikas by law, then they've started using the sun wheel. This guy is kind of interesting. This is more traditional Klan person, but he's talking about Jews are Satan's children, and he gives a number of Bible quotes to back that up, which they are in the Bible. He's also not too good at spelling. Kind of hard to see it, but down at the bottom there, he spelled Bible with an extra L. So I guess he doesn't look at it when he opens the cover every day. So what came out of this is a lot of this idea that the shields that we've seen a few times before, but not en masse like we did. And interestingly enough, a couple weeks ago there was a rally in, I believe, Sweden or Norway, where they kind of did the same thing, dressed the same way with the khakis and the button-down shirts, holding their shields and so forth. They've actually created this new website called the Shield Wall Network, trying to bring together these different groups. And you see they used the lambda symbol, which was used by the Spartans, the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae when they battled the Persian hordes. And it's interesting, they created this Shield Wall Network because essentially they view themselves as the Spartans fighting the unknowing hordes who don't understand what they're about, what their principles are, why they're the ones that are in the right. They talk about unity and so forth. And what's interesting is that besides the lambda symbol, also came out of Thermopylae was the famous quote, which many of you are familiar with, when the Persians asked the 300 Spartans to throw down their weapons, and they used this phrase and said, "Come and take them." And I know at least one person in this audience has a T-shirt like that. Gotcha, Beth. So who are these guys on the alt-right that we keep hearing about? Well, they range from guys in suits and ties to outright neo-Nazis. The term alt-right, which was coined a few years ago by a guy by the name of Richard Spencer, one of these new young guys on the scene. And he started this group called the National Policy Institute. Spencer is most famous for the speech that was given a couple weeks after the election last year, where he and a group of about 100 or 200 Nazis got up and were giving a Hitler salute and saying, "Hail Trump." Many of you probably saw that on the news. So what's interesting about Spencer is he's not your typical, redneck and so forth. This is a guy with a couple of different degrees, a master's from very prestigious universities. What's very interesting, I like about this description that he gives is he he talks about all the different media who have reported, quote, reported on him. So NPR and CNN and New York Times and so forth. And then you read down there and it says, and BuzzFeed and so on, all those people have reported on him. And then he says, Spencer has been a frequent guest commentator on the cable network RT International. Well, for those of you, if you're not familiar with RT International, that's where a lot of the fake news during last year's election came from. But as I say, you have guys like Spencer in suits and ties to outright neo-Nazis like Andrew Anglin. This was his page called The Daily Stormer. This is another version of it where he's giving a Hitler salute. And he also must be a Harry Potter fan because he photoshopped J.K. Rowling into an SS uniform, complete with swastika, which is kind of interesting since anybody who knows anything about Harry Potter knows that's completely opposite of anything that they promote. So, but one of the interesting things that came out of Charlottesville and why it's turning out to be very important is that Anglin was the first. He did literally the night of the Charlottesville rally, right after Heather Heyer was killed. He posted a really disgusting piece talking about how Heather Heyer was there to create trouble. She was part of what is known as the Antifa. And yes, the Antifa were there. They were there to cause trouble, but they were a relatively small percentage of the counter-protesters. And she was not associated with them. But he wrote this really disgusting article about how terrible she is and personal insults and so forth. And after some 20-plus years of the World Wide Web, when providers have always said, we are common carriers, we don't care what somebody posts as long as it's covered by the First Amendment, then they're allowed to do so. The internet provider for his site immediately took down his site, and that was followed by a number of others, including the Vanguard America, which I showed you earlier. And another site called Stormfront, which interestingly enough is the oldest white supremacy site online. And interesting enough, I found that one is back up. And that is a forum which literally has tens of thousands of postings every day. Excuse me. So you have a range of people in the alt-right. Just to give you an idea of some of the groups that are part of this and this is right from a guide which Anglin published on his website when it was up. The people that promote conspiracy theories, such as Alex Jones from InfoWars, many of you have heard of him. Alex Jones continues to promote the idea that the Sandy Hook shooting never happened. And then he'll try to say, well, I'm just putting on the people that say that. No, you've promoted the same thing. You have libertarians and paleoconservatives. It is their claim that these people are part of the alt-right. You have the traditional white supremacy movement, the old white nationalist movement. You have identitarian movements, which are something that we're seeing. And a lot of this with Charlottesville, with these young guys with the shields and so forth, are kind of following an identitarian idea which originally came from Europe, where young people in Europe would have these candlelit marches and things like that, and they wouldn't have open swastika symbols and things like that, mainly because they are not allowed to in some of those countries. But we have identitarian movements that are now starting to spring up here in this country. We have the troll culture, the people that are heavily online and take on anyone who criticizes them or others. They generally hang out in sites like 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, and some of them get extremely vocal, extremely vicious. They've actually been taken off some of the more mainstream sites like Twitter, so now they've gone to literally opening some of their own. But the so-called troll culture, you have something called the manosphere, which is basically, which is interesting. When I first read this and I saw this in this guide to the alt-right, I said, well, I mean, who are these guys? So they don't like feminism and think the woman should be home-producing babies and so forth. But then I took a close look at some of the sites that they were listing, and yes, the extremism and the outright hate and so forth is on those as well. And then the last one, interestingly enough, which is a little bit scary for all of us, because it's the what's known as the gamer culture. And we see, unfortunately, that on some of these online games and things, that there is a lot of hate being promoted, that people are being recruited for some of these movements, and kids that are on some of these games a good deal of the time are finding their way to this stuff. And this is not a new thing. Going back to Columbine, the two shooters at Columbine, one in particular, the leader, spent a great deal of time playing a game called Doom, to the point where he had actually contacted the company. He was programming his own versions of it and so forth, putting in some of his extremism into the games, and we know what happened at Columbine. So this gamer culture is also part of what's known now as the alt-right. So the question becomes, and we'll talk about one more thing, because just the week before Charlottesville, I was invited to speak to a group in Santa Monica. It's called the Committee for Racial Justice. It's a mixed race group, and they have different meetings to inform their members. It's basically a community group just like this. They meet at a park in Santa Monica. So in July, they wanted to discuss the subject of white privilege. Does it exist, and what is it, and so forth. Well, what happened was they held a seminar in July, and a group of guys from Orange County found out about it online, showed up to disrupt this meeting wearing masks and scarves over their faces and so forth, about a half a dozen of them. So the next month, what they wanted to do was talk about, well, who these people were, what they're about, what they're promoting, who's the alt-right. So they invited me to speak. And what was interesting is my name was never on the program. They just said somebody was coming to talk about it. Well, it got particularly ugly, and about 25 to 30 of these people showed up. As it turned out, many of the people who showed up there were people that go around the country and were in Charlottesville only a few days later. And many of them were kept out of the meeting, which the group found out that they could do so because they were specifically there to disrupt it. They had about 25 or 30 of them. When I went into the meeting, there were about 3 or 4 officers. And it got particularly ugly. Some of them tried to crash the meeting. The group had been prepared. They started banging on the windows and chanting anti-white. This group just wanted to talk about this subject and who these people were and what it was about and so forth. But they were outside chanting anti-white, which was very interesting because what was nice of them, and here, this is the Stormfront. This was the longtime white supremacy site. They posted a video on here saying, we're specifically going there to disrupt this meeting. And a couple of the others, the guy at the bottom there is a guy by the name of Johnny Benitez. He was the ringleader of this particular group. But what was nice of them, they were nice enough to post a picture on Facebook and tag themselves in it. So they post this picture, and it's hard to see on this particular screen, but if you take a close look at this, these people, the same ones that were outside chanting anti-white, this is not what you would expect from a white supremacy group, because you have Johnny Benitez, who's Colombian, you have people named Hinojosa and Martinez and others. Not exactly your typical white supremacy group. So what's interesting is, I say, they took these pictures, they tagged themselves, which was really nice, but there's also some things that have happened since, and I think this is why, in some ways, Charlottesville may have been at least a temporary high water mark for some of these people, because it drew a lot of people. They hadn't had anything in a long time. There were a couple of rallies, one in Orange County, one in Boston, that literally held the next week, which did not draw the same kind of numbers. And in fact, last week, some of the hardcore people that were in Charlottesville went back again and had another torch march with about 15 or 20 people. But what was interesting about this is that I looked at these people, looked at some of their Facebook pages and the like, and then I followed them up a few weeks later. And many of them had shut down their Facebook pages, were not online. And the reason that I think that Charlottesville was something of a high watermark is that some of this is an extension of what went on last year during a very contentious campaign. And this is not a political group. I'm not trying to get political. But what happened was that a lot of these people were very, very happy and enthused by the fact that when President Trump announced his candidacy, he immediately said, ban all Muslims. That was the charge for the extremists. And what happened was that they participated in something they now call the Great Meme War of 2016, because anyone who criticized President Trump, columnists, anybody who said anything was unmercifully attacked by people like this, and anti-Semitic things and so forth. Just to give you a couple of small examples, this is a guy, one of these extremists, a guy by the name of Baked Alaska, who was at this thing in Santa Monica. 6 days later, he was in Charlottesville. You can go home and Google Baked Alaska. You'll find his page and his columns and so forth. But this is just one example. This is a columnist with the Guardian who started receiving anti-Semitic emails because she had written editorials against the candidacy of President Trump. You had similar things that came up like this, saying that Donald Trump knows who's a patriotic American and who's not, and then similar things at people who were conservative columnists that were writing things against his candidacy as well, and many of them were receiving things like that. Then there was this particular one, and I'll show it to you larger. The actress Emmy Rossum, who was in the movie version of Phantom of the Opera, posted something. This actually took place right after the election, a week or two afterwards. And she posted something. She received this post back on Twitter. Now, what it's saying is people of your ilk will be dealt with and the like. Now, that picture there, if you don't recognize it, that's actually the gates of Auschwitz concentration camp. That's where the trains went through, and people were then deposited at the camp and separated and sent to gas chambers. And then it's photoshopped with the name Trump on both sides. So really vicious rhetoric that went on. And this is not, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that everybody who supported the president did these kind of things, but there was a very extreme element which did so, and still continues to do so today. Although the level has been lowered a little bit. But I think what's happened is a lot of those young people that showed up at this meeting in Santa Monica who were enthused by the election and by some of these ringleaders and so forth, all of a sudden they started looking at this stuff, and all of a sudden it's a little bit extreme. People are getting hurt. People are getting killed. And, you know, it's one thing to be behind the sanctity of your keyboard and typing out things and so forth. It's another thing to be there in person and getting involved and close to the violence and so forth. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. I'm not entirely sure, but it looks like I say, that was kind of a high watermark for the extremists. So what do we do about these things? Well, we have a number of programs that in the few minutes I have I'm going to talk about. As I said, our parent organization is the Museum of Tolerance. We have the Tolerance Center, which takes on current day issues and things, what's in the news, extremism, various hateful rhetoric and so forth. We have a great exhibit on the civil rights movement. We have a Holocaust section, which is an hour-long presentation about the Holocaust, literally from the beginning of the Nazi era through the end of the war, and various exhibits. It's all interactive and so forth, very compelling. But in addition to that, we also have speakers. We have Holocaust survivors. We're very fortunate that we still have some Holocaust survivors with us, although now most of them are in their mid to late 80s. But we still have a very dedicated group that come and speak at the museum, most of the time 4 days a week. Between Monday and Thursday in the afternoon, you can come in, hear a Holocaust survivor, and ask some questions. We have a former white supremacist by the name of Tim Zoll, who was in the movement for many years. He's now been associated with us for probably 10 years or so, and he speaks most Fridays. And you can, if you want to come and hear him, he's there usually in the afternoon, like 2 or 3, and you can check with the museum. We also have other programs that we do that utilize the museum. One called Tools for Tolerance, which is created for we have thousands of law enforcement personnel come through a variety of different programs at the museum to enhance their experience and have speakers and facilitations about how this affects what they do and the like. We have Steps for Tolerance for younger kids. We have a Tolerance for Teens. Our Tools for Teens, our Tools for Tolerance is actually our brand. We have an Anne Frank exhibit, which is totally dedicated to Anne Frank. We have one called Finding Our Families, Finding Ourselves, which takes the story of various very well-known immigrants, such as Billy Crystal and Joe Torre and Carlos Santana, and goes through their story and what their family experienced coming to this country. And then we have one that it goes outside the museum, and I was asked to create a program that we could take out to schools. So I created something called Students' Tools for Tolerance. And I've talked about it a little bit here, but the big thing now is social networking. And what those of us in this room don't know about social networking can fill volumes. But I guarantee you, if you go and talk to your kids and your grandchildren, they know everything. They know all the sites. They know what's going on and so forth. So what we did is we created a program which utilizes social networking and tries to get kids to understand what the perils are. So it's mainly developed for a single class at a time, although we've done some larger groups. But what we do is first talk to the kids about what their social networking uses are. We know what the answers are, but I can tell you that your kids all have Facebook accounts, but they don't use them. Because you use them, their grandparents use them, and so forth. So where do they all use? Anybody know? Instagram. They all go to Instagram. They go to. They used to be an app called WhatsApp, was the big communication app. That's out. They'll all boo about that. Now they go to Snapchat. They know their way around. We find out, sometimes we find new things that we can utilize because they'll say, well, I'm using this, that, or the other thing. That's always good to know because there's a lot of them out there, and then I turn around and use them. And because of some of the little-known apps out there, such as SureSpot and things like that, I have literally downloaded an app and communicated with a terrorist in Syria in the space of 5 minutes from the time I downloaded the app, and communicated directly with them. That's how easy this stuff is to get and use on any mobile device. So I created this program, Students' Tools for Tolerance, and what we do is we talk to them about their internet usage, and then we ask them, have you seen or heard of people being unkind on social media? Get the kids' reaction. We get them involved. Then we ask them, do you know that hate and terrorism are promoted online? The good news is most of the ones that we've talked to, and I've done this class right here at Academy of the Canyons over by COC, most of them don't know, which is a good thing. Have you ever been approached by anyone? Occasionally we find somebody who has. Most of the time, no. What do you do if you find things offensive on social media? And most of them say they just ignore it, shine it on. So what we do is then we break them up into groups, and we give them one single page from a social media site. I'll give you just some of the examples. This one is funny racist jokes. It's kind of an equal opportunity racist joke page from Twitter. Got African American jokes. It's got Muslim jokes. It's got blonde jokes. The one thing it doesn't have, interestingly enough, is Jewish jokes on it. So I'm kind of thinking maybe it's probably even put up by a Jewish guy, but who knows? Everything's anonymous. So that's one. Another one is this one. It's just a generic kind of white pride site. It's got some really offensive hashtags and things like that. Hard to see, but the name of the page up in the top left on there is Exterminate the N-Word. This is a page denying the Holocaust, saying the Holocaust didn't happen, Anne Frank's story is a phony, etc. There's a lot of this type of stuff online. I'm not going to go through all those. Then there's one which is an anti-Muslim page. And we have others as well. We usually will break a class up into 5 groups or so, depending on how big the class is. Then what we do is after they've all looked at the page and they've talked among their group about them and what they found and so forth, then we have their group report back to the class what they found, can ask them questions, facilitate a discussion, and so forth. Gets them involved in it, and I don't use any organized groups or anything that would lead them to the Klan or the National Socialist Movement or anything like that. But the problem is if kids really want to find that stuff, or even if they don't, sometimes they'll trip over it online. So we talk to them about these various sites, and then we talk to them about what the consequences of hate are and give them some examples. So, for example, Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof was a white supremacist, spent a great deal online, had his own page, uploaded his manifesto, saying that blacks are inferior and the like. But he spent a great deal of time online. Then what did he do? He walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, sat in a prayer meeting for literally an hour, and then opened fire, killing a dozen people. Wade Michael Page, a longtime white supremacist, spent a lot of time online watching conspiracy videos and music videos and things like that. Walked into a Sikh temple in Wisconsin and killed 6 people. So hate does have consequences, and online hate has consequences. We've got some other examples as well, but you get the idea. And then we talked to them, the last thing we talked about is what you can do about it. So first thing is take hate seriously when you see it online. Every platform, whatever it is, will have a way to report hate material that you see. Do that. Take it seriously. When we asked the kids in the beginning what they do when they see hate online, most of them say we just ignore it and so forth. We really want them to take it seriously. Understand it's out there and something needs to be done about it. We say it has consequences. We say report it not only to the online people, but also we have an app that we ask them to use called Combat Hate. If they don't want to report it online, they can report it to us, and then we use it in our meetings with social networking companies and the like. So there are other things that we can do. I'm running out of time, so if there are any quick questions, I'll be happy to take those and see what you think. Thank you. My pleasure. Gee, Steve, I would have never thought.
Well, I don't know why you're picking on me. I mean, really, do you have an issue with me? Or?
No.
Okay. If you got your information about Charlottesville from the television, then I'm very concerned. I lived in Glencoe, Illinois, when the Nazis marched on Skokie. And as you know, the Supreme Court said that the Nazis had a right to march in Skokie. As I understand it from Charlottesville, the neo-Nazi groups, and I'm not familiar with all the names, had gotten a permit to march or to demonstrate in that park. Is that your understanding? Or
Yes.
not? Okay. And that the police were told to stand down.
Yeah, that's my understanding too,
Okay.
at least for a time.
And the Antifa, which you seem to diminish, just from what I heard, you said that there was a small amount of Antifa. They were the ones wearing the masks and not revealing their identity. I noticed in your show here, you didn't show any Antifa. You didn't show any BLM. But the Antifa, to my thinking, really agitated and provoked the violence for the purposes of the media coverage of that event.
Okay.
And I'll ask for your comments on that
Okay.
because
Let me answer the
because I
question.
don't believe that we're getting the straight.
Okay,
There's a whole
answer you.
story behind Charlottesville.
Let me ask you. First of all, I don't get all my coverage. I watched the video so I could see what was happening. I get my information on Charlottesville from the source material, from these guys themselves, from the other side. I get it from a lot of different places. I don't take everything I saw on the news. What I did find fascinating in watching that was what I saw in the imagery. And yes, the Antifa was there. The Antifa, their sworn objective is to disrupt things like that. It is a concept that is actually the Antifa. Nobody heard of it here in this country. It's been around in Europe for years. What I said was that yes, there were thousands of counter-protesters. Yes, the Antifa were there. They were not a large percentage, but yes, they were there to cause trouble, and they did. And I saw that as well. There's no question about it. I also look at what was said by the extremists after Charlottesville when they said the police forced us into confrontations and things like that, which I do not take seriously at all. They've taken this idea all of a sudden they were victimized by law enforcement, and I don't believe that for a minute. So I get my information from a lot of different sources about this. And yes, whenever you have any kind of march like this, wherever it is, you always get counter-protesters. And yes, counter-protesters are usually causing a lot of the problems and are usually the ones getting arrested as well. No question about it.
But what is your position?
Thanks.
Rick,